Have you ever wondered what your family would do if they thought you were about to die? Richard McAllister, a real estate tycoon with over $850 million in assets, decided to find out in the most brutal and brilliant way imaginable. He pretended to be dying, just to see with his own eyes who truly loved him, and who was already counting the zeros in their inheritance. For 7 days, inside his colonial mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, Richard faked a battle with terminal cancer. Every tear, every gesture, every whispered word in his bedroom was recorded. But what he discovered, no one was ready to see. Because sometimes, when you remove someone's mask, what's hiding underneath is a monster. And Richard, playing the part of a powerless dying man, witnessed things no father should ever have to see: betrayal, lies, and a level of greed that shredded any bond of blood. It was early December, and the cold in Greenwich felt sharper than usual that year. The McAllister mansion, with its towering white columns and double-glazed windows, sat cloaked in a silence that bordered on funereal. Inside, Richard McAllister, 73, woke before dawn in his master suite, just as he had since he was 27, when he bought his first commercial property in the Bronx. But now there were no meetings on his calendar. No urgent phone calls, just one lingering presence: emptiness. Since Helen, his wife, passed away 2 winters prior, Richard had spent most days reflecting, not on real estate, markets, or investments, but on the one thing that had always taken a back seat: his family. The silent dinners, the forgotten birthdays, the mechanical hugs, all came flooding back as painful snapshots. What had he really built after all? An empire or a farce? One of those sleepless mornings, seated in his dark leather armchair on the 2nd floor, Richard heard it. Voices, muffled but unmistakable, coming from downstairs. Andrew, the eldest, was speaking with William, the middle son. "He's slowing down. He won't make it past Christmas," one voice said, hurried and impatient. "We need to start preparing, Will." Richard froze. His aging heart pounded like there was an intruder in the house. But it wasn't a stranger. It was his son's. He didn't say a word that night, nor the next day. But something inside him broke, irreversibly. For the first time in decades, Richard didn't feel like the patriarch of the McAllister family. He felt like dead weight, a burden ready to be tossed aside. And that feeling gnawed at him more viciously than any illness ever could. Silently, he began observing, testing small things. He pretended to be more tired, accidentally left pills out on the table, mentioned bouts of dizziness. The reaction was always the same: a brief glance, a fake smile, and then eyes back on their phones. It was Margaret, the housekeeper, who suggested he speak with Dr. Colin Brooks. "Mr. McAllister, maybe you should talk to someone, a therapist perhaps," she gently offered one morning. But Richard already knew what he had to do. Dr. Brooks, the family physician for 25 years, initially refused. "This is extreme, Richard. It's cruel, even." But the old businessman simply met his eyes and said, "Cruel is dying without knowing who really loved me." The decision was made by the end of that week. The plan: to stage a collapse on a Sunday morning when everyone would be home for a rare family brunch. Dr. Brooks would deliver the fake diagnosis: terminal pancreatic cancer, 3 weeks to live, just enough time to reveal the truth, or the lies. Margaret would handle the hidden cameras, discreetly placed in the hallways, lounges, and studies throughout the mansion. Every word, every gesture would be recorded. The night before the performance, Richard barely slept. He paced around his room, staring at old photographs. His young sons, Helen smiling in Nantucket, the first company office now demolished. He wondered, a lump in his throat, would any of them miss him, or just the money? That Sunday morning, everything was in place. As the scent of waffles filled the kitchen, Richard collapsed theatrically into his favorite armchair in the living room. His breathing grew labored, his hands trembling. Margaret screamed, summoning everyone. Brooks, already stationed nearby, rushed in carrying a medical bag and a grim expression. The diagnosis was delivered in a calm, solemn voice. "It's cancer. Advanced. He doesn't have much time." From that moment on, Richard became a dying man. Still, silent, but more alert than ever. The test had begun. The diagnosis echoed through the mansion like a thunderclap held in check. Terminal pancreatic cancer. 3 weeks to live. The silence that followed was deafening, brutal in its stillness. Andrew squinted, as if trying to hold back a tear, or maybe just hide his relief. William rubbed the back of his neck, muttering something about rearranging his schedule. Thomas arrived last, still wearing a cap from his band's tour and reeking of sweet-smelling smoke. He simply nodded with fake solemnity. Richard, lying in the grand canopy bed of the master suite, pretended to be sedated, his eyes half closed, fixed on the ceiling, but his ears were wide open, catching every word uttered in hallways, lounges, and guest rooms. The mansion's intercom system, modified by Margaret, transmitted everything, and what he heard was poison dripping into his soul, drop by drop. That first night, the sons began taking turns by his bedside. Andrew came in first, the eldest always in a suit, holding his iPhone even in the room of his supposedly dying father. He approached, dragged over a leather chair and sat. For a few seconds, he studied Richard's face with an oddly blank expression. Then he took his hand, gently squeezed it and whispered, "If you can hear me, know that we'll take care of everything." His tone was comforting, almost believable, but Richard knew his son too well. What lay beneath was calculation. Moments later, thinking he was alone, Andrew stood up. He walked to a small filing cabinet in the corner of the room, tried to open it. Locked. He opened the desk drawer, sifted through folders, kept glancing over his shoulder like a clumsy thief. Richard, eyes barely open, slowed his breathing to appear asleep. But inside, his chest burned with rage. It hadn't even been 12 hours since the announcement of his imminent death, and they were already looking for wills. After Andrew left, Sarah came in, his daughter-in-law, always polite, always pristine. She brought flowers, white roses, knowing full well Helen had hated them. She sat beside the bed with a sad smile and words that were too sweet to be sincere. "You've been like a second father to me," she said, taking his hand with theatrical tenderness. But her eyes, they weren't on Richard. They were on the wall safe behind the desk, on the watch collection, on the paintings inherited from Europe. When she thought no one was watching, she stood and began checking the picture frames. One of them hid the key to the safe. She pocketed it, but before she could open anything, the door opened. William stepped in, the middle child, more reserved, colder. He made a curt gesture, as if to say, "This is absurd." But what he whispered to Sarah in the hallway broke another piece of Richard's heart. "Not now. Wait till he's dead. Then we can sort everything out." Later that night in the library, William made a phone call. His voice was low, but the words captured by the intercom were razor-sharp. "Yes, I'd like to know the process for contesting a will in case the testator is no longer of sound mind." Richard heard it all, motionless. His body tingled with disbelief. William, the calm one, the son who always avoided conflict, was already consulting lawyers. He hadn't even begun to say goodbye, and was already preparing for legal war. Near midnight, Thomas finally showed up. Disheveled, with bags under his eyes, he seemed the least interested in the performance. He paused at the doorway, hesitated, then walked in slowly. Sat down without saying a word. And for a few minutes, Richard thought, maybe here was something real. But then Thomas pulled out his phone and started a video call with his girlfriend Daisy, right there next to the father he thought was dying. "It'll be just a few more days. With my share, we can open that indie bar in Brooklyn or even Seattle. It'll be epic." Richard fully closed his eyes, not for the act, but from real pain. It was only the first night, and already the illusions were gone. All through the mansion, The footsteps of his children echoed in quiet halls. Their conversations seemed concerned, but hid darker intentions. Margaret, watching from the security monitors in a private room near the office, kept a grave expression. She had known that family for 40 years, changed Andrew's diapers, helped William with homework, listened to Thomas's teenage confessions. But what she saw now wasn't love. It was ambition, cold, bare, rotten. By the end of the night, as the house sank into heavy silence, Richard realized what he was uncovering wasn't just their decay. It was the depth of his own failure as a father. He had raised heirs, not children, executives, not human beings. He had built an empire of bricks and dollars, but a home with no soul, and that was just the beginning. On the second night, the Connecticut cold felt sharper than ever. Inside the McAllister mansion, the fireplaces burned steadily, but no warmth could reach Richard's soul. Lying still, like a corpse rehearsing its final pose, he felt no physical pain. What was growing in his chest was something else, the pain of disappointment, of grieving a family that was still breathing, but already dead inside. In the grand hall, linen curtains swayed faintly. Around 10:30 p.m., the three brothers gathered there, assuming their father was asleep under the effect of heavy sedatives. They sat in front of the fireplace, sipping expensive bourbon, their eyes cold, completely at odds with the supposedly grieving atmosphere. What took place in that room was captured from 3 different camera angles, and when Richard watched the footage hours later, he wouldn't know whether to cry, scream, or vomit. Andrew was the first to speak. "We need to be realistic," he said, crossing his legs like a CEO in a boardroom. "If he sees us united, supportive, he'll leave everything as is. He's sentimental," remembers Mom. "We can't give him any reason to change anything." William nodded. He'd already spoken to the family lawyer, he said. If there were any changes to the will, they could claim Richard wasn't mentally fit. Thomas, more relaxed, dropped the line that froze his father's spine. He should have retired years ago. Clung to the company like it was part of his body. Maybe it's time he understood his cycle is over. Cycle. That's how they spoke of their father's life. Like an expired product, like a stock that had lost market value. Listening through the intercom, Richard felt real tears stream down his face, not part of the act, tears from deep, silent pain. There wasn't a single word of gratitude, no fond memory, no "we'll miss him," just strategy, calculations, greed. But what came next made all of that seem almost innocent. In the early hours of the morning, Sarah returned to the bedroom. No flowers this time, no rehearsed words, just her phone pressed to her ear. Thinking she was alone, she paced back and forth like a businesswoman closing a merger. "Yes, baby, yes, I know. Just a few more days. When he's gone, I'll fly to Miami, I promise. Everything's almost wrapped up here. The will is solid. Andrew suspects nothing." Richard felt the blood in his veins turn cold. Miami? A lover? Sarah, the woman he'd embraced as a daughter, was just waiting for his death to run away with another man. Worse, she wasn't just cheating on Andrew. She was orchestrating the entire family charade. In the same call, she laughed and said, "Even the boys are rehearsing well." She was talking about the grandkids. Richard slowly sat up in bed, alone in the dark, biting his lip hard. Was there anything left that was real? The next day, Margaret handed Richard a flash drive. It contained a recording of a conversation between William and his girlfriend, Ruby, a stunning young model from New York, often seen posting selfies with William at charity galas. The footage showed the two arguing. "I'm not an actress, Will," Ruby snapped. "I've been smiling at your family for 3 months, pretending to love you while you pay me for it." William, cold as ice, replied, "1 more week, then you get your money and walk. I need to look stable. You're part of the plan." It was all fake. The entire relationship, a poorly written script funded by inheritance expectations. Richard listened with closed eyes, fists clenched, as if trying to tear through his own skin to wake up from a nightmare. But this wasn't a dream. This was his family. Thomas, who had seemed like the least involved, turned out to be the worst. While the others maintained their masks, he was already selling off pieces of the mansion online. Margaret found listings on auction sites for artwork, porcelain, even dining room furniture, all described as belonging to the estate of real estate mogul Richard McAllister. And worse, Thomas had contacted a tabloid reporter, offering an exclusive on his father's death in exchange for a generous payment. "The old man was a tyrant," he wrote in an email. "His death is a relief for all of us." When Richard read that, his world shattered. The son he thought was the purest, the one who stayed out of the business world, who seemed the most authentic, was the most cynical of all. But the final blow came that afternoon. Margaret brought him footage from the grandkids' room. 2 boys, 9 and 11 years old, Andrew and Sarah's children, were playing make-believe. One lay on the bed, pretending to be Grandpa. The other approached, saying, "Grandpa, I love you, please don't die." Then they both burst out laughing. Mom told them to rehearse the lines until they memorized them. They'd memorized lines, like child actors in a twisted play. That was too much. Richard didn't cry, didn't scream. He simply stood up slowly and stared at his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back wasn't the same. He wasn't the proud father anymore, nor the invincible businessman. He was a man betrayed by everyone around him, a man alone in a house full of relatives, and at that moment, something inside him hardened. A new Richard was born, cold, strategic, determined. If his family wanted to stage a cruel comedy at the cost of his death, he would give them the ending they deserved, but not as the victim, as the author. From that moment on, the plan was no longer a test. It became revenge. In the days following that devastating revelation, Richard McAllister was no longer a dying man. He was an architect of vengeance. With the same cold precision that had once helped him buy out entire neighborhoods and negotiate with mayors and bankers, he now sketched the blueprint for a different kind of project. Not a skyscraper, but the collapse of a facade, the collapse of hypocrisy. On the morning of day 4, as the pale winter sun bathed the mansion in soft gold, Richard asked Margaret to summon his attorney, Robert Whitman. "I want to update my will," he said in a weak voice, knowing this news would spread through the family like wildfire. And just as expected, Andrew was the first to knock on his bedroom door, face masked in concern, eyes gleaming with hunger. "Dad, I heard you're thinking about changing the will. Can we talk? Just us?" Richard feigned hesitation, took a deep breath and nodded. The game had begun. With a frail, deliberate voice, Richard looked at Andrew and said, "You've always been the most prepared, the most responsible. I want you to take over the company when I'm gone, and more than that, I'm leaving you 60% of the shares, along with the presidency. I just need you to sign these documents. They're to protect the company from taxes and legal disputes." Andrew didn't blink. He picked up the pen, like a king accepting his crown. He signed every page, his smile smug and triumphant. What he didn't know was that the documents, drafted by Whitman with surgical legal craftsmanship, contained embedded confessions, leaking confidential information, making deals with foreign competitors, embezzling funds to offshore accounts. All legally signed, date-stamped, intentional. Richard watched in silence, almost moved, not by what he was losing, but by what he was gaining, the power to expose the ones who'd shattered his heart. And Andrew was only the first. That afternoon, it was William's turn. The patriarch said he'd had a change of heart, that he believed William deserved the Florida properties and $90 million in liquid assets. "You've always handled expansion so well. I just need you to sign these standard legal protections." As always, William remained stoic, but his eyes gleamed. He signed without hesitation. Like Andrew, he was sealing his own downfall. The papers detailed the fraudulent nature of his relationship with Ruby, misuse of company funds to maintain appearances, and serious tax evasion, all elegantly written, but utterly incriminating. The next morning, it was Thomas's turn. Impulsive, easy to manipulate. Richard performed a rare moment of tenderness. "Despite our differences," he said, "I've always admired your courage to forge your own path. I want you to have the art collection, it's yours. But you'll need to formalize your acceptance. There are legal issues with provenance, transport, museum red tape." Thomas, visibly emotional, nearly cried. He said he always thought his father despised him. He signed everything in seconds. Those documents outlined illegal sales, stolen property, and even attempts to blackmail the press. Things Thomas never bothered to read. Sarah required a different approach. Richard asked her to sit with him alone, told her he trusted her, saw strength in her, understood her pain. "I want to secure your future, Sarah. Yours and the boys. I'm leaving you $15 million personally, but I'll need you to sign something acknowledging it, so my lawyers won't contest it later." Sarah, eyes shimmering with fake tears, smiled and signed. Those papers not only revealed her affair with the man in Miami, but documented her psychological manipulation of her own children. Full confessions, disguised as legal contracts, all handwritten, all admissible. By the end of that day, Richard wasn't just holding documents, he was holding truth, signed, sealed, and soaked in ambition. It was like constructing a building in reverse, a fortress made of moral ruin, where once there was a polished image of a model family. Attorney Robert Whitman placed the files in a vault at the firm's Manhattan office under strict instructions. "These papers are to be released only upon my written request, or in the event of my death." Whitman, a man of absolute discretion, understood the game and approved. "Preparing for an earthquake, Richard?" he asked on his way out. "No," Richard replied, gazing out over the snowy horizon from the library window. "I'm preparing the ground for when it hits." Ish. That evening, while the children toasted quietly in guest rooms, convinced they were just weeks away from inheriting the McAllister empire, Richard walked down the West Wing stairs into a room where Margaret monitored the footage. He sat beside her. Together they watched hours of video, listened to audio, they laughed, they cried, they went silent. And at the end, Richard said only one thing: "They think they're writing the end of my story, but I'm the one writing theirs." He was no longer a victim. He was the judge, the prosecutor, and the executioner, and the verdict was near. By the dawn of the fifth day, Richard McAllister no longer felt tired, angry, or even sad. What he felt was clarity. Like a general before the decisive battle, he knew that every piece was now in the right place. There were no doubts left, no regrets. His family, had dug their own grave with soft hands and rehearsed smiles. Now, all that remained was to bury them with the sharp spade of truth. Richard's plan, carefully engineered behind the quiet walls of his mansion, was about more than revenge. It was a lesson, a manifesto, one final act meant to echo far beyond the Persian rugs and marble halls. He didn't just want justice, he wanted it to be seen, recorded, shared. Because a private betrayal breaks your heart, but a public one breaks your reputation. And so he made his first decisive phone call to the New York Times. Not to the general newsroom, but to a trusted editor, someone who had once covered McAllister properties years ago. "I've got a story for you, David, but you'll need to be here. Saturday, 10 a.m. Bring someone from Forbes and People magazine. This isn't just about business, it's about blood." His second call was to Ethan Granger, a discreet but well-known notary respected for his legal integrity. Richard asked for his presence at a living reading of the will, explaining he wanted it done while he was still alive, to ensure no contestation. Granger was surprised, but agreed immediately. By late afternoon, Richard gathered Margaret, Dr. Brooks, and Attorney Whitman in the East Wing conference room. The four of them, seated around a long walnut table, knew they were about to stage something unprecedented. "Everyone will be there Saturday," Richard said. "My sons, their wives, the grandkids, the lawyers, the press. And then we show the world who they really are." Margaret, strong but soft-hearted, spoke up gently. "Are you sure you want to do it this way, Mr. McAllister? There could be consequences for everyone." Richard took her hand and said firmly, "Margaret, the consequences already happened. I lived 73 years believing a lie. Now it's time to free the truth, whatever it costs." Over the next 2 days, the mansion was transformed into a silent stage. Video technicians arrived discreetly to set up a large projection screen in the grand hall. Cables were hidden beneath Persian rugs. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle. The central table was decorated with white orchids, Helen's favorite, a symbolic gesture as if saying, "You'll see this with me, darling." The children, of course, suspected nothing. To them, Saturday would be their father's final farewell, an emotional moment to reinforce the family bond and secure what they believed would be a favorable will. Andrew had his blazer tailored. William rehearsed polite thank-you speeches in his head. Thomas spent the night before writing lyrics for a future album, inspired by the pain of losing his father. Richard didn't sleep Friday night, not from anxiety, but because he was reviewing every last detail. He reread the documents, rewatched the videos, rehearsed his words. He didn't want to fumble a single line. This was his last grand performance, but this time there would be no acting, only truth, raw, painful. At 5 a.m. he took a long shower, put on the charcoal grey custom suit he had worn the day his company went public, tied a deep navy blue tie in a firm knot, a symbol that he was still in control. Then he stood in front of Helen's portrait in the hallway for several minutes. "Today, my love, they're going to learn what it means to stain our name." At 9:45 a.m., the house was silent. Only the footsteps of guests echoed through the marble halls. At exactly 10 a.m., Margaret led everyone to the grand hall. The children were there, lined up. Sarah held the boys' hands. Ruby, William's hired girlfriend, offered polite smiles. Thomas wore dark sunglasses, trying to look solemn. Attorney Whitman, Notary Granger, and Dr. Brooks were already in place, recorders ready. The atmosphere was thick with fake tension. No one really knew what to expect. Then, at 10:15, the door opened, and Richard walked in. Not with the staggering steps of a dying man, but with the proud stride of a king confronting his traitors. Dressed in sober elegance, eyes sharp, expression calm, he walked to the center of the room as if stepping onto a battlefield. And in that moment, everyone understood. Something was wrong. Or rather, something was finally right. The show had begun. The silence in the McAllister mansion's grand hall was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Every eye was fixed on Richard. Not a sound, not a movement. Even the grandchildren sensed that something was deeply wrong, though they didn't yet understand what. Andrew stood first. "Dad, what is—" "Sit down, Andrew." Richard's voice sliced through the air like steel. "You're all going to listen now, because what I have to say won't be whispered anymore." He walked to the center of the room, standing beneath the massive baccarat crystal chandelier. Margaret handed him a small remote control. He pointed it at the wall behind him. The curtains drew back, revealing a massive projection screen. Richard pressed the button, and hell began. The first video showed Andrew opening drawers, rifling through papers, whispering to Sarah in the hallway, "Just wait till he dies. We'll deal with everything after." Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the shelves like a predator hunting her prize. The room fell into stunned silence. The second clip showed William on the phone. "I want to know how to contest a will if the testator isn't mentally competent." Then a scene with Ruby. "You help me look stable. That's all I need from you." The third showed Thomas, alone in a guest room, photographing art pieces to sell online. Authenticity guaranteed. From the estate of magnate Richard McAllister. Ships after his passing. Next came footage of him video chatting with a tabloid journalist. "Yes, I've got exclusive details. He was a tyrant, a dictator dressed as a grandfather. Each video hit like a gut punch, one after another. Sarah whispering to her lover, "I'll be in Miami soon, baby. The old man's almost gone." William signing papers, his eyes glinting with greed. Thomas bragging about fooling everyone. Ruby counting her cash, laughing. With every clip, the children lost more color in their faces. Andrew was sweating, William was shaking. Sarah muttered excuses under her breath. Thomas stood pale as a ghost. The journalists scribbled furiously, snapped photos, recorded everything. It was an avalanche of truth, unstoppable and undeniable. When the last video ended, Richard slowly turned to face them. His eyes were calm, his voice ice cold. "For 7 days I watched you reveal who you really are. I hoped for sorrow. What I got was strategy. I hoped for remorse. What I got was fake smiles, eyes scanning my estate, plans to bury me before I even died. You are not my children. You are shadows, parasites who bear my name." He nodded to attorney Robert Whitman, who opened a briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents. "These are your signatures, all legally recorded, each one a confession. You thought you were signing inheritances? You were signing your sentences." Andrew tried to rise, flustered. "This is a setup, Dad." "A setup?" Richard cut him off. "You sold confidential company data. It's recorded, documented, signed. As of this morning, you are officially removed from the board. The SEC and all shareholders have been notified." He turned to Sarah. "Adulteress, manipulator, a mother only on paper. Your children are being placed under the temporary custody of my sister by legal motion already underway." William started to explain. "I only wanted to protect our image. For you. You hired an actress, lied about your life, deceived everyone and embezzled funds. The IRS already has it all. I hope prison has good acoustics for your excuses." Thomas, now standing, mumbled, "You never really loved me." Richard stepped closer. "I loved you more than all of them, because I thought at least you were honest. But you sold our story to tabloids like it was scrap metal. You didn't kill me with poison. You killed me with your words." Then he turned back to the notary. "Read the will." And so the new will was read aloud. 80% of the fortune, $680 million, would go to the Helen McAllister Foundation, dedicated to supporting children with cancer and funding arts education for underprivileged youth. The real estate in New York and Palm Beach would be converted into cultural centers. The remaining assets would be distributed among long-serving company employees, including Margaret and Dr. Brooks. McAllister Properties would become an employee-owned cooperative. Not a single cent would go to his children. When the reading ended, no one spoke, not even the reporters. Only Margaret's tearful eyes moved. Then Richard spoke one final time. "You killed me 1,000 times in your thoughts. But today, I'm born again, free of you." He turned his back on them and walked calmly toward the west wing of the mansion. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. As his children left the mansion like defeated shadows, some silent, some cursing under their breath, others simply in shock, Richard remained seated in the library where it had all begun, the very place where, days before, he had overheard the first lies. Now it was the space where justice had taken root. He didn't feel joy, not vengeance. What he felt was peace, that strange, quiet peace that comes only to those who no longer owe anything to anyone. For the first time in decades, Richard McAllister was not a hostage to family expectations. He was the master of his name, of his ending. In the months that followed, the story exploded in the American press. Headlines showed the pale, stunned faces of Andrew, William, and Thomas, disinherited heirs, the patriarch who faked his death to expose his family. Forbes and the New York Times ran features on legacy, ethics, and the fragility of blood ties in the face of unchecked ambition. Legal attempts were made to overturn the will, but all failed. The signatures were there, the evidence undeniable. The videos went viral. The Helen McAllister Foundation grew rapidly, receiving donations from thousands of people moved by the story. Richard came to be seen not just as a mogul, but as a man who had the courage to say enough, even to his own children. He never saw them again, not during the holidays, not on birthdays, but he was never alone. The foundation brought him new connections, children laughing, young artists exhibiting their first paintings, teachers crying as they received funding for their struggling schools. Richard used to say he had adopted 100 grandchildren and 1,000 sons, all of them people who didn't wait for his death to show him love. The Greenwich mansion was converted into an exhibition centre with a wing dedicated to the real McAllister family story, not the polished, perfect version, but the truth. On one of the wooden panelled walls hangs a single engraved quote, "Blood builds heirs, but character builds a family." Richard lived 4 more years after the reveal. He passed peacefully in his sleep on a cold winter night. No pain, no guilt, no fear. If this story moved you, made you think, or gave you a new perspective on what truly matters, leave a like. Comment below. What would you have done in Richard's place? Would you have had the courage to go all the way? Share this with someone who needs to hear this lesson about love, truth, and boundaries. And remember, it's not truth that destroys families. It's the lie.